Welcome to this special edition of In the Lighthouse, your safe harbor from the storm. With your host, the Lighthouse Keeper, Daphne Collins, bringing you Heroes of the Old Testament.
Hello, and welcome to this special edition of In the Lighthouse, your safe harbor from the storm. This is Daphne Collins, your Lighthouse Keeper, welcoming you back as I present another episode of Heroes of the Old Testament. And today we're going to continue with this final installment of our two-part series entitled A Tale of Two Queens. And the second featured queen in our story is Esther. So before I begin our story of this Persian queen, I want to provide you with some historical, biblical context that will set the scene for Esther. Although extra-biblical sources do not provide evidence of the woman to whom the book is entitled, it is important for you to know what was going on in the world during her time and why this queenly character left a lasting impact on our biblical history. Our story begins in the womb and a battle for supremacy between twins born under a covenant made between God and their great-grandfather, Abraham. These twin sons grew to be strong men with great generations to follow. One would supplant the right of inheritance away from his brother through trickery, but his twin would also surrender it foolishly. These twins were named Esau and Jacob, and when the time came, both men departed with their wives and families to lands beyond one another because their possessions were too great for them to dwell together. So Esau settled in the hill country of Seir, that is, Edom. Esau's son, Eliphaz, had a concubine who bore to him a son named Amalek, who in turn became the father of the Amalekites, the people to whom the Israelites fought at Rephidim. In the Exodus account of the Bible, the Amalekites were known for attacking the Israelites unprovoked from behind after they'd finished crossing the Red Sea and running from Pharaoh's chariots. In the 17th chapter of Exodus, the text explains, "Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven.' And Moses built an altar and called the name of it, 'The Lord is my banner,' saying, 'A hand upon the throne of the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation.'" According to Bible scholars, the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt occurred around 1612 BC, and as the Lord predicted, war with Amalek did indeed extend from generation to generation for his chosen people. Esau's descendants, however, proved to be a constant foe for Israel, its distant cousin. During the anointing of the Benjamite warrior Saul as the first king of Israel, the Lord sent his prophet Samuel to deliver a message concerning Amalek and its destruction. And Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people Israel. Now therefore, listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them. but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. And Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and devoted to destruction all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen, and of the fattened calves and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. When we selectively listen to a direct command and modify our obedience to it, the consequence of our decision should not come as a surprise in our reckoning. Exceptions are not made for kings whose agendas are exposed under the scrutiny of a holy God, irrespective of what side of the covenant they fall under. Such was the verdict delivered to Saul from God through his prophet Samuel, following his war with Agag, king of the Amalekites. And the Lord sent you on a mission and said, "Go, devote to destruction the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed." Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you pounce on the spoil and do what was evil in the sight of the Lord? And Saul said to Samuel, "I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. I have gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me. I have brought Agag the king of Amalek, and I have devoted the Amalekites to destruction." The more we try to justify our actions, partial obedience is still disobedience. Saul was sent to utterly destroy Amalek on the battlefield, as well as all the men, women, children, and animals encamped with them. But Saul spared Agag, and others were left alive, as well as unblemished animals he wanted to retain as spoils of war. This was not, however, God's instruction to Saul. The consequence of his disobedience was the loss of his kingship. Instead, God sent Samuel to slay Agag. However, not all Amalekites were killed that day. This generational foe of Israel once again slipped through the cracks because of one king's disobedience. Yet God's promise of the destruction of this branch of Esau's tree would stand. God's promise and provision of his chosen people, Israel, proved faithful to the generations as long as his people obeyed the law given to them by his servant Moses and stewarded by the anointed kings left in the charge of God's nation. Unfortunately, many of the kings responsible for leading the people in obedience to the law led them to idolatry instead. Despite the warnings from the prophets, these kings followed the ways of the nations surrounding the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. The consequence of their disobedience was captivity from a stronger foe. First, the Assyrians over Israel, and then the Babylonians over Judah. It is to the lands of the east where our story begins, to the kingdom of Babylon, where the Jews were taken into captivity. Following their captivity, and to encourage them, the prophet Jeremiah relayed a message to the people. Build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. For thus says the Lord, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you and I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will hear you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will restore your fortunes and gather you from all the nations and all the places where I have driven you, declares the Lord. And I will bring you back to the place from which I sent you into exile. The Jews did as the prophet encouraged them, and they settled and flourished in Babylon. Some of them distinguished themselves as exceptional leaders and advisors to the king. One such advisor was the prophet Daniel, who, under God's guidance, interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's complicated dream of a great image whose head was made of gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. This dream was the foretelling of the fall of the Babylonian kingdom to the Medes, and then their subsequent defeat in 539 BCE by Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Medo-Persian Empire, whose boundaries expanded well beyond that of Babylon or Assyria. It is through this empire, beginning with King Cyrus, that God's prophesied purpose for his people's return from captivity begins, and the elimination of an ancient enemy is ended for all time. Okay, let's get started. The Medo-Persian ascendancy and the fall of Babylon were foretold by the prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Daniel. Once God's purpose for Babylon reached its intended conclusion, the Medes and the Persians soon became his instruments of the fulfillment of the prophecies. King Cyrus, whose name God placed on Isaiah's tongue centuries earlier, became a great king and founder of one of the vastest empires in human history. But God's purpose through this ruler, as prophesied in Jeremiah 25, verse 11, was to begin the campaign of restoring the Jews to their homeland. Approximately 15 years after the timeline of events of our story, the prophet Ezra led a group of returning exiles to Jerusalem. Ezra spoke to the people about King Cyrus the Great. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem." The prophet explained how King Cyrus commissioned the first leaders of the people's exilic return to the province of Yehud, Judah. The first governor of Judah for King Cyrus was Sheshbazzar, who was sent to lay the foundation for the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Ezra also told the people, Cyrus the king also brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and placed in the house of his gods. Cyrus, king of Persia, brought these out in the charge of Mithridath the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. All these did Sheshbazzar bring up when the exiles were brought up from Babylonia to Jerusalem. The book of Ezra describes how God fulfilled his purpose of restoring his people back to the land he promised Abraham. Through the years following the commission of King Cyrus II and the rebuilding of the Second Temple by Zerubbabel, the nephew of Sheshbazzar and second governor of Judah, many Jews chose to remain behind in Shushan, otherwise known as Susa, the capital city of the Persian Empire and the citadel where the events of our story take place. Our story begins with a large feast in the majestic palace of Xerxes I, also known in the Bible as Ahasuerus, king of Persia and grandson of Cyrus II, who founded the Achaemenid Empire. He returned home from the Greco-Persian Wars in late 480 BCE after two great battles fought against the Greeks that year. One at Thermopylae, where the Persian forces were victorious by land. However, in September, the Persian fleet sustained a horrific defeat against the smaller Greek fleet in the straits at Salamis near Athens. Xerxes' return was bittersweet, which strengthened his resolve to one day return to avenge his loss to the Greeks. It was necessary, however, for the king to return to Susa to allay the concerns of his advisors over domestic skirmishes happening within the empire, which extended over 2 million square miles and held half the world's population. The king must therefore remove the armor of the warrior and put on the raiment of a political sovereign. During one particular event that was held at the palace, the king and his advisors and royal officials were well into their cups when one of the officials requested the king to send for his queen to come before them, arrayed in her royal crown. Xerxes, pleased to entertain their request, sent his principal court eunuch to summon Queen Vashti, his royal wife, who was also hosting a banquet for the officials' wives at a separate location within the palace. The court eunuch returned to the king with the news that Vashti openly refused his royal summons to appear in her crown. When his advisors and royal officials heard that the queen refused, they expressed their concerns about the political ramifications of Vashti's refusal of her royal husband's command to appear during a royal function. Their concerns were over the impact this refusal would have on their wives and the women throughout the empire. One of the king's wise nobles, Memucan, contended that news of the queen's actions would quickly spread and lead to a revolt of wives within their homes. These nobles advised the angry king that Queen Vashti would need to immediately surrender her crown and be banished to the outer harem, never to be presented to the king for the remainder of her days. The sentence for her blatant disrespect to her sovereign would have been her death, but the advisors were aware of her popularity in the empire. Her role as queen consort was an honorary and political one, strategically appointed for the purpose of uniting the empire under one king. In her place, they advised that a search for virgins of marriageable age would be conducted throughout the empire, and they would bring the women back to the palace with the intent of crowning a new queen who has been chosen by the king. Pleased with their recommendation, Xerxes commanded the officials from all the provinces to proceed, and he ordered his lead eunuch over the harem, Hegai, to oversee the preparation of these women, which would last for a period of 1 year before a few favored ones would be presented to the king. Some scholars contend that approximately 400 young women were rounded up throughout the empire and brought to Susa, the capital. Given the expanse of the Persian Empire, this number is not a surprising one. It is by this commission that the providential hand of God enters. The citadel of Susa, or Shushan to the Persians, was where a Jewess named Hadassah lived with her cousin, Mordecai, a Benjamite, who raised her as his daughter from a young age following the death of her parents. Both Mordecai and Hadassah were born in Susa during the exile of the Jews following their captivity in Babylon. They were among the Jews who remained behind in Susa even after the building of the Second Temple in Jerusalem during the reign of Xerxes' father, Darius I. Mordecai was a low-level clerk to a court official at the palace, so when he heard about the campaign to gather young virgins of marriageable age, believing that she may be taken, he instructed Hadassah not to disclose her Jewish background and recommended she change her name to Esther. Obedient to her cousin's cautionary suggestion, Hadassah, now Esther, soon found herself being carried off to the palace and away from the man who loved her and called her daughter. Quick-thinking Mordecai, however, used his position as clerk to a court official to position himself near the king's gate to learn whatever he could and to assist her by any means possible. Esther settled quickly into the routine of the palace harem under the direction of the lead eunuch, Hegai, whom she watched and obeyed carefully. She sensed his authority and remained silent to his authoritative voice. Some of the girls who were brought in from far-off places did not cope as well as Esther. Many of them missed their families and their lives. The palace was strange and foreboding, as was the giant eunuch overseeing the harem. The surroundings and food were more than Esther could have ever imagined. Harem life, she learned, was for the privileged who would one day be given an opportunity to meet the king, and, if she gains his favor, the candidate will be crowned queen consort. Until such time, according to Hegai, they were to begin a year of beautification treatments for their possibility of meeting the king. As the year progressed, Esther learned that she wasn't the only one doing the observing. She noticed that the giant eunuch was also unobtrusively observing her. As he did with all the young women going through the beautification treatments, Hegai stoically watched through lidded eyes and spoke only to the servants guarding the harem. Although she dearly missed Mordecai, Esther kept her paces, obediently keeping with each level of treatment as directed by the quiet, watching eunuch. The first 6 months consisted of courses of purification, cleansing, healing, and restoration. The months following were to prepare them in courtly comportment, cosmetics, and communication. The months of preparation passed swiftly as Esther grew more comfortable with the presence of Hegai and found that she looked for him each day. He became aware of her notice until one day the large man approached Esther and engaged her in conversation. She was shy at first at his general questions, but he eased her discomfort with his gentle, rumbling voice, and she opened like a flower for the eunuch. Haggai found that he enjoyed her wisdom and wit. Haggai was impressed from the start with Esther. At first, he thought it was a ploy to have the appearance of modesty, but this young woman personified womanly grace without artifice. She was engaging and pleasant, and her comportment was sure to please the king and his officials, Haggai thought. Thus, Esther found favor with the lead eunuch, who began to share his thoughts with her and personally advised her on the things he knew were sure to please King Xerxes. Moreover, given that the queen consort was also a political figure, Haggai stressed the importance of queenly comportment and obedience. This, he knew, would please the prickly nobles of the king's court. Through the months of Esther's confinement in the harem, Mordecai busied himself with the duties of his position. He distinguished himself in his role, which gave him more responsibility at court, and enabled Mordecai, as a leader in his community, to attend at the king's gate and keep his ear open to any palace intrigue. Much to his delight, he learned that his beautiful Hadassah, now Esther, also distinguished herself at court and was brought before the king. Moreover, she gained the king's favor and was soon to be crowned queen consort to King Xerxes. The vacancy made available because of one woman's disobedience became the doorway through which God would deliver his people. King Xerxes I made Esther of Susa his queen consort over the Persian Empire and was pleased to display his beautiful wife in all her finery and her crown before his royal advisors and nobles of the provinces. Mordecai, now a lead clerk to a royal advisor of the king, was present to see Xerxes crown his new queen before the court. Mordecai rejoiced with all the others over the king's pleasure of Esther. He could see that Xerxes was clearly taken with his cousin's beauty, and she looked as if she returned his love. He went home that evening, marveling over the amazing outcome of Hadassah's capture and subsequent ascension as queen of the entire Persian Empire. Months passed as rumors of marital bliss and the king's delight trailed throughout the streets of Susa and beyond. Mordecai enjoyed hearing the latest comments about the loveliness of Queen Esther and her calming influence at court. He also heard that Haggai, the lead eunuch, was her personal confidant and advisor. Furthermore, Haggai ensured that communication channels were opened for the queen to send messages to Mordecai and receive them back. Thus, Mordecai, ever the watcher and leader of his community, saw the benefit of being positioned at the king's gate and listening for anything that would provide protection to his cousin, the queen. It just so happened that Mordecai was indeed in the right place at the right time when he overheard two palace eunuchs discussing their plans to assassinate the king. Through his channels of communication, Mordecai sent a message to Esther and informed her of the plot to kill the king and identified who the perpetrators were. Esther immediately informed her husband, the king, of this plot. By command of the king, the two eunuchs were arrested and killed, and Mordecai thanked. Because of Mordecai's swift action, the details of the assassination plot and his reporting of it through the queen were written in the king's chronicles. Because of this recent villainy, and to ensure that his affairs and security were handled directly, Xerxes promoted a court security official named Haman as the principal minister to the king and distinguished him to be his highest official. Although he was not of noble birth, Haman, the newly appointed minister of the king, was proud of this great honor bestowed on him. He went home to tell his wife, Zeresh, and their 10 sons all about the king's appointment of him. Then he paraded himself all around Susa to receive the people's adoration and praise, as was his due. While Haman enjoyed the adulation of the people, he approached the king's gate and noticed that one man did not bow down, as did the others around him. Angered by the disrespect shown him, Haman inquired about the identity of the man. He learned that the man was a Jew named Mordecai, a clerk to one of the court officials. Unbeknownst to palace officials, Haman was an Agagite, a descendant of the Amalekites, an ancient enemy of Israel. Haman easily understood his immediate hatred of Mordecai to be tied to an ancient blood feud that would have to be avenged. The following day, he approached the king with a report, in his official capacity, concerning a group of people who had been the primary cause of unrest in Susa, as well as the provinces of the empire. The issue of unrest had been the reason for Xerxes' return to the capital when he wanted to avenge the loss at Salamis. Hoping to rid the kingdom of this menace, Xerxes listened closely to Haman's report. The wicked minister spun the tale that the Jews were enemies of the empire and had been stirring things up, and recommended the extermination of the Jews in order to keep the peace. Moreover, to appeal to the king's vanity, Haman proposed to sweeten the deal by offering to pay 10,000 talents of silver to those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries. Strangely, King Xerxes, because of his single-minded vow of vengeance for his defeat at Salamis, had forgotten the very people whom his grandfather and father protected and commissioned to return back to their ancestral homeland. Instead, he gave his minister his signet ring of authority to issue a decree in his name. As it was with Jezebel, another enemy of the Jews, Haman used the signet ring of a king as a means for murder and annihilation. A decree was issued to the king's satraps and governors over all the provinces, to every people in their own language, reporting that a lot, or pur, was cast for the 13th day of Adar for the genocide of the Jews, which included young and old, men, women, and children, in one day. Upon hearing the king's edict concerning the annihilation of the Jews, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and sat among the ashes as he mourned loudly at the king's gate. As the word spread, the sounds of lament were heard throughout Susa. Esther received a disturbing report from some of her handmaids and one of her eunuchs that Mordecai was seen sitting in ashes at the king's gate and wailing. She sent clothes for him, but he refused them. Deeply distressed, Esther urged Hathach, one of the palace-appointed eunuchs, to inquire after Mordecai and report back to her. He returned with a copy of the decree and a message to Esther from Mordecai, requesting that she go to the king and plead to him on behalf of her people. Esther heard the message from Mordecai and read the edict of the king. Esther informed Hathach to tell Mordecai about the law of entering the presence of the king without being summoned. It is a death sentence no exceptions, that is, unless the king himself extends his golden scepter for that person's amnesty. She also wanted her cousin to know that she hadn't been summoned to the king's presence these past 30 days. These two issues were barriers to his request for her. In response, Mordecai replied, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Esther responded to the wisdom of Mordecai with a request. "Go and gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Let's take a moment for this short break. When we return, we will continue with the conclusion of part 2 of A Tale of Two Queens and our story of Esther.
Does your knowledge of sin make you hate it? Does your knowledge of Christ make you trust and love Him? Does your knowledge of God's will make you strive to do it? Does your knowledge of salvation and hell make you passionate to witness to the lost? In Luke 4:33, 34, and 41, we see clear religious knowledge possessed by the devil and his demons. Twice in these verses, we have proof of this. "I know who you are, the Holy One of God," was the language of an evil spirit in one case. "You are the Son of God," was the language of many demons in another. Yet this knowledge was a knowledge unaccompanied by faith or hope or love. Those who possessed it were miserable evil beings. Beloved, we must beware of an unsanctified knowledge of the truths of Christianity. We may know the Bible intellectually and have no doubt about the truth of its contents. We may have our memories well stored with its leading texts and be able to talk gloriously about its leading doctrines. And all this time, the Bible may have no influence over our hearts and wills and conscience. We may, in fact, go all our lives saying, "I know this and I know that," and sink at last into hell with those very words upon our lips. Beloved, make sure today that your head knowledge becomes heart knowledge, resulting in a holy change in your heart, your will, and your conscience. Indeed, believe in your heart that Jesus has risen from the dead, and confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and you will be saved. Praise the Lord. This is Lane Wilder for Carry the Light Ministries, bringing you insights from an elder.
Welcome back. We will now continue with part 2 of A Tale of Two Queens and the conclusion of our final queen, Esther. When her time of fasting was complete, Esther, with the help of her handmaids, donned her queenly garbs and was resolved to enter the king's court uninvited. Esther knew the consequences of this action, but she also knew and trusted in the purpose of the period of fasting and prayer she'd finished. Although his name was not mentioned in the book, nevertheless, God was in control, and he would go before her as she entered the king's presence. The lives of the Jews were paramount in Esther's thinking, and she promised Mordecai that she would plead for her people, even if it meant her immediate death. Her shoulders squared and her back straight, Esther walked in the direction of the king's court. King Xerxes was slumped on his throne, half listening to an exchange between one of his nobles and his minister, Haman. Both men were discussing the recent edict sent out on behalf of the king concerning the Jews as enemies of the king. The noble satrap inquired whether enough evidence had been procured by the court before issuing such a sweeping command for the annihilation of an entire population. Incensed by the man's questioning of his authority, Haman was slowly becoming irrationally angry at the noble. Suddenly, the large golden doors opened to the outer court, and the men's attention turned to the light of the afternoon sun as a figure of a woman entered. King Xerxes leaned forward and looked at the approaching figure, who was obscured by the bright light behind her. Then he saw that it was his queen, Esther, who was slowly approaching his throne. He heard the voice of Haman issuing an order to the court eunuch. "Stop her from advancing in the king's presence. She has not been summoned." Yet Esther could not be thwarted in her mission to come before her royal husband. Her people's lives were more important than court protocol. Then the voice of the king was heard above Haman's. "Let her come," he shouted. And as Esther came to the foot of his throne, she went face down and waited. The king looked at her adorned in her finery and remembered his affection for his beautiful queen and extended his golden scepter. When she heard the gasps of the men in the court, she glanced up to see that the king gave amnesty in her favor. Seeking to allay her fear of him after she touched the tip of his scepter, Xerxes asked Esther, "What is your request? It shall be given you, even to the half of my kingdom." To this, Esther made the request for the king and his minister Haman to come to a feast she prepared for them that day. And the king immediately accepted on behalf of himself and his minister. The feast was prepared and consumed with pleasure by the king and Haman, and afterward he asked Esther once again what was her request of him, using the same language as earlier. Breathing in slowly, with the wisdom she prayed for before speaking, Esther replied, "My wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." Enchanted by her gentle request, both men accepted her invitation graciously. Haman, pleased by the course of events at the palace, was returning to his villa and passed through the king's gate. Once again he encountered Mordecai, sitting in sackcloth and ashes and not acknowledging his presence. Hatred boiling inside, he proceeded to his home. Later, he gave his wife Zeresh and his visiting friends a full account of all that happened at the palace. He made careful mention of the additional distinction paid to him by the queen's invitation to her feast that evening. And she also invited me and the king to be in attendance with her once again tomorrow for another feast, he told them. I would be contented if indeed if I did not have to pass that filth, Mordecai, who sits at the king's gate every time I come and go from the palace. Partakers of the same wicked spirit as Haman, residing within them, Zeresh and his friends suggested, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast." This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made, knowing that a public humiliation of Mordecai in the presence of his own people would satisfy a small portion of Haman's need for revenge. Their complete annihilation would rectify the blood feud of his ancestor, Agag, king of the Amalekites. Unable to sleep that night, King Xerxes called for a court clerk to read to him from the king's chronicles of the past months. As the clerk relayed events, the king was reminded of the assassination plot that was foiled by the quick action of the Jew, Mordecai, as reported to him by Queen Esther. The next morning, Haman arrived to see the king in contemplation over a matter when Xerxes asked his minister to recommend a reward that should be bestowed on someone who has done a distinguishable honor that the king would like to make known to the public. Pompous and self-absorbed, Haman, thinking the king wanted to honor him, said to Xerxes, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" Very pleased by Haman's suggestion, the king ordered him to do all that he recommended and personally see to the honors of this distinguished citizen of the empire, Mordecai the Jew. Mortified, but daring not to disobey the king's orders, Haman set forth to fulfill all that he was commissioned to do. He sought the man, Mordecai, and donned him in the royal robes and crown, and put him on the king's horse, and paraded him through the streets of Susa, proclaiming for all to hear, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Humiliated by the events of the day, Haman returned to his home and related all that the king ordered of him, including the identity of the man the king wanted to honor. His wife and friends listened to Haman's account with concern mixed with fear. Although it was not apparent to Haman, nevertheless, his scheming wife and friends regarded one another, noting the harbinger of doom befalling Haman, who was thinking only of the gallows being constructed on his property. He did not hear their warning as a knock at the door announced the arrival of palace eunuchs to escort Haman to the queen's feast at the palace. Once again, following the delicious feast prepared for him, the king asked Esther the same question in the same manner as before, his affection for his wife shining in his eyes. This time, prompted by an invisible hand, Esther replied, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish. and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." Naturally confused, the king inquired about the identity of the man who would be so presumptive as to threaten his queen. She pointed across the table at the man and replied passionately, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Xerxes rose and walked out to the garden terrace with a dawning realization of exactly who the people were that Esther was referring to: the Jews, the people to whom his grandfather and father granted amnesty and protection years ago. By his own signet, their lives, including his wife's, were subject to annihilation because of his own minister. How could he have been so blind? Determined to make things right for Queen Esther and the Jews, Xerxes began thinking of a plan to reverse the edict's command. He turned and walked back to the table where Esther was sitting, but Haman was draped over her lap and pleading for his life. The king's fury erupted immediately at the sight of his wife being molested before his own eyes by his own minister. How dare Haman touch his wife and queen? Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? He thundered. Harbona, one of the eunuchs loyal to the queen, spoke up and told the king that Haman commissioned a gallows to be built to hang Mordecai the Jew, the man the king honored earlier that very day for saving his life. Upon hearing this, Xerxes commanded the eunuchs to remove Haman from his sight and hang him on the gallows that were built for Mordecai. Feeling remorse over the events that were miraculously unfolded by his clever wife, King Xerxes awarded the villa of Haman to Queen Esther, who, in turn, awarded it to Mordecai. The king also awarded Mordecai his signet ring, which was taken from Haman before he met his death. Then Esther, falling to her knees before her royal husband, pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman to kill the Jews on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. The king shook his head, remembering the edict that held his signet, and told Esther and Mordecai that once sealed, the edict is irrevocable. Mordecai, with the authority given by King Xerxes, assembled the scribes to prepare a new edict in the name of the king and sealed it with the king's signet to be sent out to all the 127 provinces within the empire. This new edict would supersede the previous one sent by Haman regarding the massacre of the Jews on the 13th day of Adar. The new edict entailed that all Jews within the empire had the king's approval to defend themselves against any armed force, person, or province coming against them and to strike them down. Furthermore, permission was granted to them on that day to plunder the goods of those who would dare come against them. This decree, issued from the citadel of Susa by the king and sealed with his signet by Mordecai, was sent by the king's swiftest couriers on his royal mounts throughout the provinces. After this, Mordecai was honored to replace Haman in the eyes of the king. Then the day arrived, and the Jews were prepared to fight against anyone who would lay hands on them. the Jews received help from the satraps, governors, and royal agents to overcome anyone who hated them. They were victorious over their enemies and did not choose to collect their spoils of war. The king told Esther about the victories of the Jews in Susa, detailing that 500 men were killed, including the 10 sons of Haman and all of his friends and conspirators. Esther requested that the Jews be permitted to hang the sons of Haman on the gallows the following day. The king agreed to her request, and on the 14th day of Adar, the Jews killed an additional 300 men in Susa and hanged the sons of Haman. Then, on the 15th day of Adar, the Jews in Susa rested and feasted with gladness, whereas those who resided in the countryside celebrated on the 14th day of Adar. Mordecai, by his official signet and the king's pleasure, sent letters obliging the Jews that every 14th and 15th day of Adar is commemorated as the days when the people overcame their enemies and turned sadness into gladness and from mourning into a holiday. He declared that these be the days of feasting and sending gifts of food to one another, rich or poor. They called the festival Purim, after the term Pur, which was the lot that was cast for their annihilation. Furthermore, these 2 days are to be remembered annually throughout the generations as a celebration of overcoming their enemies. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, gave full written authority confirming this second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus in words of peace and truth, that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them, and as they had obligated themselves and their offspring, with regard to their fasts and their lamenting. The command of Esther confirmed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. 2 queens, both beautiful and influential, held the ear of their king. The historical queen, who was called Jezebel, introduced the cult of Baal and Ashtoreth to the northern kingdom of Israel, whereas the fictitious queen named Esther held to her faith in the God who is not mentioned once in the book of Esther. Queen Jezebel, the Baal priestess of Sidon, had a nature similar to Haman the Agagites, prideful, vindictive, and deadly. Both of them sought dominance and took authority with a king's signet ring to kill and destroy. Queen Esther and Mordecai, on the other hand, were similar to Elijah, who held fast to the Lord and received restoration and wisdom amid the potential threats against their lives. Queen Jezebel called for a fast as a means of covering her actions against Naboth. Queen Esther called for a fast to seek God's wisdom for the deliverance of her people, knowing the risk of death was imminent one way or another. Whether famous or infamous, their names have withstood the test of time. The Bible recorded their history so that we could learn from their mistakes and triumphs. Thank you for joining me in this second story from Heroes of the Old Testament for this In the Lighthouse podcast. I hope you enjoyed part 2 of our saga, A Tale of Two Queens, and this week's heroine, Queen Esther. In part 1, I spoke of the clear contrast between these two queens mentioned in the Old Testament. When a light is shown on biblical figures such as these, and their stories are brought to the forefront, the only conclusion we can affirm is that God is omniscient and omnipresent. Moreover, as Romans 8:28 explains, He makes all things work together for good for those who are called according to His purpose. If you enjoyed this episode, would you consider subscribing to this ministry on our platform on Podbean and online at YouTube or Rumble? And please like us so that Carry the Light will gain some momentum. We truly are small fish in a big ocean, so your support of this ministry will help us share the light of Jesus Christ with the world. You can also click the notification bell to let you know when we upload the next video. Sing hallelujah and share this video with your friends. You can also email me directly at thelighthouse@carrythelightministries.com. Transcripts for this and all future episodes can be found in our show notes. We welcome you to visit us at The Lighthouse on the web at www.carrythelightministries.com. And of course, follow us on social media. I'm your lighthouse keeper, Daphne Collins, with Carry the Light Ministries, bringing you this special edition. Until next time, be blessed.